Hello, everybody. I am Paul Davis. I'm the CEO and founder at First Light, and we are an agency that's worked with JATO for now around a decade. I'm lucky enough to work with Felipe Munoz for a number of years, and today we are picking his brains about what he saw in his recent visit to the Beijing Motor Show. And over the course of this conversation, we're going to be asking him about a new report that JATO has published looking at the Chinese automotive market and asking some bigger questions about what's happening in the wider market, particularly around EVs. Felipe, thanks so much for joining us and thanks for your time.
Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me here. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
We're going to get straight into this. I think anybody watching this video will know that the Chinese market has outperformed many people's expectations over the recent years, and the EV market is going from strength to strength in particular. Could you tell me if you saw evidence of that continuing when you were in Beijing recently, and what you picked up from the show and from talking to other people on the ground?
Well, look, the Chinese are definitely disrupting the global market. It's a new force, something that the industry has not seen ever before. In the past, yes, of course, we saw the arrival and expansion of Japanese car makers, then Korean car makers, but nothing as it is happening right now with China. China is the journalists, analysts, and everybody, even the people who don't know about cars, they are starting to talk about it because they are really changing the way we conceive cars. It was good to be in Beijing Motor Show because actually is what I saw there, the magnitude, the size of the event, the quantity of people, media, and new vehicles is crazy. It's just a different world. You feel like the West is being has been sleeping over the last years when you see this strength that you from the Chinese car makers.
Let me ask you a couple of questions that are linked, Felipe. What does that look like in terms of the number of new OEMs in China, and what are the consequences for, let's just call them legacy OEMs, Western OEMs that used to see China as an emerging market? What did you pick up from the floor of the show?
A lot of new brands, new models, new segments for all kinds of customers. I mean, they are not only targeting one specific part of the industry, but all of them. So you find new models, new brands in the lower segments, in the compact ones, the luxury ones, SUVs, MPVs. So a lot of things, yes. And this is, of course, having an impact outside China, because even though most of those brands and models are still basically available only in China, because China is the world's largest market and it has, let's say, room for so many players, some of them are starting to see abroad or to look for opportunities outside China, because the growth in China is not as dynamic, let's say, or is not as strong as it was in the past. So the arrival of these new brands, new models outside China is representing a threat more than anything else to the legacy car makers, because these cars are coming with very high quality, with very competitive prices, and a very appealing designs. In China, we're talking of more than 150 brands, local brands, and you can find everything there. But the most aggressive ones and the most ambitious ones have products that are at the same level in terms of quality and performance of the cars from Europe or the US. There's nothing to envy.
And do you think that that makes it harder for established Western brands to target the Chinese market, or do you think that that market is getting smaller and smaller every year as those domestic brands become more prominent?
Yes, that's another reality. The fight is not only outside China, but it's also inside in China, because historically the foreign brands led sales there because they had the know-how, and that's how they arrived there. They arrived through joint ventures with local manufacturers, but at the end, the know-how and the experience and the heritage and the prestige was coming from the West. And now many Chinese consumers are choosing to drive Chinese brands. And actually, last year, Volkswagen lost its crown in China as the best-selling brand over there after many years leading that market. And it lost it to BYD, a Chinese maker. It seems, which is a very dangerous thing for the legacy firms, that driving a non-Chinese car in China nowadays is becoming an old-fashioned thing. That's not good at all for brands like Volkswagen or the Germans, because it's like saying that if you drive Chinese, you know what you know about cars, and you know about electric cars and performance and software.
Right, that is a worry for any brand. And we're recording this conversation at the beginning of the Euros tournament, and BYD are everywhere. I've seen them pitch side advertising it. It's clear that they want to project their brand onto a global stage. Do you think that ambition, combined with the market saturation in China now, because as you said, that growth can only go so far, do you think the consequences of that will be greater sort of Western tariffs and protectionism? And if that happens, how will those OEMs in China react? Will they seek other new markets, or will they retaliate domestically?
Yeah, the growth, the exponential growth of the Chinese car makers is having an impact everywhere. So in China, as I just said, the drivers are starting to consider seriously the local brands, because they finally can offer something competitive. And and outside China, this is becoming a political issue, because as they are so competitive, and they have, most of those Chinese car makers have vertical integration in which they produce almost everything in-house. Then they also have secured the supply chain when it's about batteries, which is something that has not been done in the West successfully yet. Then you have all the tools, let's say, to come export your cars with very competitive prices that are going to be a headache for the established car makers in those markets. You see, in early June, the European Commission decided to impose tariffs to the Chinese electric vehicles up to 38%, which is a lot, because there is this idea that China is subsidizing its cars so they can come to Europe at lower prices. What I can tell you is that most of the Chinese EVs are cheaper than the ones produced in Europe. The question is it because of the subsidies, or is it because Europe is not competitive enough? So anyway, it's becoming a political thing, not only in Europe, because those tariffs are going to start a war trade with China, but also in the US, where you cannot buy any Chinese brand, but still those brands have a big tariff. It's happening in Turkey, and many countries are getting ready to this offensive from China, not through cooperation or collaboration, but through tariffs, which at the end is a negative thing for the consumer. That's the only victim, the only casualty from this is the consumer.
Right. And I suppose some Chinese brands have another way into those markets through acquisitions, MG, Volvo. Those brands are already perhaps perceived by consumers as being British, Swedish in this example. Do you think that those brands will prosper despite the tariffs, or will they be folded into that?
The latest tariffs imposed by Europe are changing. They change according to the car maker. So it's not that all cars coming from China are going to have the same tariffs. No, it's different. So it starts with 17% for BYD, up to 38% to MG, which is also a Chinese player. But also, it will include those cars made by Western car makers in China and exported to Europe. So it depends on what brand it is. But the Chinese car makers are making use of many ways to expand their business. So one of them, as you just pointed out, is, for example, the acquisition of Western brands. MG was acquired by SAIC. MG, a British brand, 100 years old British brand, was acquired by SAIC, a Shanghai automotive group. I think like 15 years ago, and since then they have been able to revive this brand successfully. I mean, MG, or one of the MG's products was the 4th best-selling electric vehicle in Europe last year. So it's a big thing. It's something that you would not have imagined when the brand was struggling to survive under the British ownership. Then, for example, Geely bought Volvo and also Lotus, for example. So we are having these operations. They know that that's the easiest way to gain traction in the West, through the acquisition of travel brands. That's one way. But the other way, which I think is, because actually that way of acquisition, I don't think it's going to happen anymore, especially because of the political tensions. I don't think Europe will allow more European companies to be bought by Chinese, and the opposite, and the same with American ones. So I think the way forward is through cooperation or collaboration, or let's say, yes, joint work, joint ventures, in which both parties have a win-win situation. Europe needs China. It's the biggest market in the world, but China also needs Europe. Europe is the 3rd largest car market. They don't have access to the US, but they want to become global. So what do? You need to be in Europe. Otherwise, you're missing
Right.
2 big important markets. No, if we exclude India, which India is also another nightmare for China in this at the moment, but they both need each other, and the best way to go on is through cooperation. And now we have seen this. Volkswagen, for example, is cooperating a lot with Xpeng for the development of platforms for electric vehicles. Stellantis just bought 20% stake on Leapmotor, which is a minor player in China, but which is due to start producing cars at Stellantis factories in Europe soon. So operations like these are the best way to face these tariffs, because tariffs are just a short-term solution, but they don't solve the real problem that Europe has, which is the lack of competitivity when it's producing electric cars.
But I think one of the areas I'd be interested in your view on is how the driver experience is sort of center stage with some of the manufacturers, the technology that surrounds the driver, the kind of innovation that's taking place in the cabin and beyond. Did you see any of that in Shanghai, and what can the legacy manufacturers
in Beijing
learn from that?
Yes.
Yes.
No problem. Actually, I saw that in Shanghai too. But look, the fact that they properly secured the supply chain for the production of batteries allowed them to also focus or spend resources and time on the other key elements of an electric car, and that's mainly software. You can tell from an electric vehicle in China that it works, and the infotainment works. It's easy, and it's designed to facilitate life to the driver. That's something that the West is still struggling, and that's why, for example, companies like some companies are struggling to sell their electric cars in China. I mean, Western car makers, because their software is too complex, it's not efficient, and it's not conceived for the driver. And the Chinese doesn't only have an advantage when it's about batteries, but also an advantage when it's about software. Of course, we would need to test that in the West. In China, it's clear that they have an advantage, and so they are moving faster also in that way.
And maybe part of the reason is that, kind of these things. People are, the new consumers, they are brought up being very familiar with devices that are, feature rich, software driven, flat screen, built around their needs, very, very configurable, putting them in charge. And I wonder whether the Western legacy OEMs are used to, here's the new model, take it or leave it. We've made some changes, get on with it. Whereas maybe in a highly competitive 150 manufacturers in China makes that a highly competitive market, and that maybe is driving innovation. And I wonder if we're missing out because we don't have the degree of that kind of competition in the West now as a result of the tariffs. What's your view on that?
Yes, you're right. Look, when I was in Beijing Motor Show, I just loved the experience to see these cars get in. And every time I got in a Chinese car, there was this wow effect. And I'm not talking of these luxury, super powerful SUVs. I'm talking of all different kinds of cars, even city cars. There was this wow effect in terms of quality, in terms of screens and technology, features, and many things, which is something that it seems that we have lost in the West. You just get in a car in Europe or the US, yes, they are very well built, good quality, but there is nothing that you really are impressed or something that you remember when you come back home after the dealer. Nothing. And at the same time, cars are becoming more expensive every day. So the ability of Chinese manufacturers to integrate the increasing technology solutions into the cars is going definitely faster than the West, and you can tell it in Beijing. Everybody was around. You saw the crowds only in the Chinese brands. Those brands from abroad, and I'm talking of the big ones from Europe mainly, they didn't grab the attention. You didn't see a lot of people in those stands because that's not where the change, or let's say the innovation, is really happening.
I mean, that's a really interesting trend, and I'm interested. There's lots to unpick there. Obviously, I'm interested in the idea of cars as entertainment, with that sort of added wow factor that you talked about. I'm also interested in whether you're seeing that at the higher end categories, the luxury end of the market. Are you seeing those sort of legacy Western brands still retain that status, or is that being eroded as well? Is this across the entire market?
Well, yes, it's also changing in the upper segments. And the best example is what we saw from BYD and its luxury brand Yangwang, what we saw at Hongxi, which is a luxury brands as well. They are also trying to grab a piece from these very profitable segments with something new with massive batteries, stunning performance specs, and all of that. So they are targeting everything. Of course, the premium segments are more difficult because in the premium world, the heritage and the image are very important. And this image that, for example, brands like Mercedes-Benz or BMW have been building this image for more than a century. So they already are positioned as the luxury cars everywhere in the world. So when you get there with a new brand, Yangwang, for example, it's hard to convince someone driving a Mercedes to stop buying Mercedes and just move to something new. But the fact that they are trying to tells a lot, because it seems that there is no limit for them. There is no forbidden segment for them. They might succeed, they might not. I'm not saying that the public is going just to change the taste one day, I mean, suddenly, but it's very remarkable that they are trying in those very difficult segments.
So we've talked about segments. Let's talk about markets. You talked about the EU. You've talked about the US. You touched on India being difficult, but what about other emerging markets where a leapfrog technology, i.e., helping countries that have been used to scooters move into cars and leapfrogging the internal combustion engine and deploying EVs at scale to an emerging middle class, and at scale and at a price point that Western companies struggle to meet? I'm thinking about parts of Southeast Asia, thinking about parts of Africa. Are these markets kind of in these? Is it a focus for some of these Chinese OEMs?
You're right. The usual conversation around cars in general, not only electric, is about what happens in USA, in China, and Europe, and sometimes Japan, sometimes Korea, but that's it. But the world is also, the rest of the world is also driving and it's also buying cars, no? And we are talking more or less about 1/5 or 22% more or less of the global sales are happening in those markets. And I'm talking of Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, India, Southeast Asia, mainly. Unlike the developed economies, those markets are really growing. That's where growth is taking place. And that's something that China wants. And actually the West should be also paying attention to that, because if you just concentrate your efforts on the US and Europe, those two markets are not growing anymore. In those markets, I mean, in the emerging ones, you already find, of course, the legacy firms. Toyota is very strong in Southeast Asia and in Middle East. Volkswagen, Stellantis are very strong in Latin America, for example, and in many other cases. But the EV is changing all. The Chinese EV is changing all. The real battle between China and the West is not happening neither in Europe nor in the US. It's happening in the emerging world, where the population is more price sensitive. So whenever there is a competitive or an affordable choice, that you're going to have more chances of success than in Europe, for example, where the income is higher now. And that's where the Chinese offer is really changing the market. It's really changing the game. And that's why I say that's where the real battle is happening, because where those markets is where you can see the legacy firms losing a lot of market share due to these competitive Chinese EVs.
Let's talk about some outtakes for some of the legacy OEMs who I know kind of listen to what JATO is seeing in these markets and relies on your data and your observations. What would be your sort of 3 outtakes for them, given what you saw in Beijing, given what we've talked about? How should they be thinking about the challenge or the opportunity to collaborate with some of these OEMs?
Look, I think that they have things that Chinese don't have. It seems like, oh, everything is bad for the West and everything is good for China. No, it's not the case. I mean, if we're going to talk about advantages that Europe or the US have that China doesn't, we're talking about know-how, the dealers networks, the after service know-how, because it's not only about the car, it's everything around it, and the West has been doing cars, has been making cars for more than a century, so they know how this business is about. They have global presence. Toyota is almost in every single country in the world. Hyundai and Kia are almost there also in terms of global availability. China doesn't. China has just started to see the world 5 years ago. So you need a lot of experience as the West, as the legacy firms have. So it's not everything bad for the West. What I'm saying is that the speed of the Chinese innovation and progress is so fast that it seems like the West is going to lag behind anytime soon if they do not do anything now. And when I'm saying to do anything now, I mean to find ways of collaborating with China. If the world is moving towards electric vehicles, then you have to work with the one who knows more and has the more capabilities and has the resources, which is China. But you cannot just avoid China and just leave it there and just impose some tariffs and pretend that that's not our problem. No. China is there and it's going to expand its business no matter the tariffs. So the best way to deal with that is not by combat.
Yes.
Combat this rival, but to work with him. We should see more of this, because as I said, China is very good at doing these things, but they cannot do it everything. They need the know-how, the experience from the West. And
so
the West,
it's a bit of a
win-win situation. Yes.
Yeah, it's a trade. We lend you some of our brand heritage. You lend us some of your technology and your supply chain. We lend you some of our after-sales service knowledge. We give access to our market. You give us access to your market.
Yeah.
I guess ultimately, Felipe, it's in the consumer's interests for this to happen, because if there is, if better product is being produced in one market and it's not available elsewhere, then the consumer is losing out.
Yes. It's the final loser of all of this is the consumer. We will have less choices, or even the same choices but more expensive.
It also sounds like the brands that get that right, that collaborate in the right way, that access that market and technology and supply chain, they may be the brands that have a head start, that have an advantage in their domestic Western markets as well, because they'll be able to leverage that technology and that infrastructure as well. And so it's in their interest to do it rather than to lobby for tariffs, because I'm sure a lot of that's happening in Brussels, in Washington right now, when actually they should actually be opening the door and saying, let's work together.
Instead of spending time and resources on blocking the imminent arrival of Chinese car makers, they should be spending more time on bringing on developing competitive products. That should be the case. but unfortunately, yeah, we always go for the fast and easy solution, which is not going to be a long-term solution, because that won't stop China from coming. Yeah.
Well, Felipe, that's been a fascinating conversation. I feel I've been on a journey there. I was sort of excited by what's happening at the motor show. Then I was pessimistic about the tariff war, and now we've ended, I think, on an opportunity, which is to collaborate and to kind of work together and take a longer term view on things. So thank you for bringing this conversation perhaps to a happier conclusion than I thought it would do when we started.
Just one thing, Paul. The cooperation is what an ideal world would be, yes, but it's not going to be hard. It's not going to be easy. China is totally different from the West. The way they live, the way they operate, everything from paying anything, from taking a taxi, everything is different there. So the integration with the West is not going to be easy because we're too different. But that's a challenge, to learn how to deal with these differences, but for good, not for bad. Thank you very much, Paul.
Thank you, Felipe. It's been a fascinating conversation. I know that JATO has a new report out as well, which I'm sure we will link to below this video. And if people want to get a deeper dive into this conversation and some of the data points that sit behind it, they can click on that, register and download the report. Felipe, thanks so much for your time. Thanks so much for bringing back your observations from the Chinese market. What an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Bye-bye.